Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Collision Den. Here to talk about the latest comic book movie, Madame Web. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So I think even the most die-hard geeks among us will have to admit that the comic book movie genre has been in a bit of a rut. I think kind of the once bankable genre that would dominated the Hollywood box office really for the last decade or more has fallen off of that kind of lofty pedestal with just a string of kind of lackluster comic book movies. It's definitely been a rough stretch, and now Madame Web is scuttling into theaters to remind audiences that there's still a ways further that this can fall. Because I think despite having a very capable, charismatic lead actress in this, and at least to me, a very intriguing premise of a hero that has a superpowered mind and not just a superpowered body, this film falls flat in almost every way conceivable. Because this film, it weaves together just a dreadful script, a very stilted, exposition-heavy dialogue, almost jarringly bad special effects, and just an overall lack of excitement, which makes this movie, at least to me, one of the worst comic book movies in recent memory. Which is kind of too bad, because I do think this movie had some potential. I seem to be one of the few people that actually thought the trailers looked fine. It looked like it could have been kind of a fun movie. And it is an origin story, a very firmly an origin story, which like outside of a few like kind of flash forward vision scenes, the entire film kind of takes place before any of these characters have sort of adopted their, heroic persona or, worn their spidery suits. Because on the surface, in some ways, this is kind of a refreshing throwback to more like the early days of the comic book movies, which featured more kind of personal challenges for the heroes rather than the big kind of cosmic end of the world stakes. And despite sort of the lingering stigma of her starring role in 50 Shades of Grey, Dakota Johnson is a very talented kind of capable actress. I think she is well cast in the lead role as Cassie Webb. It's just that unfortunately in this film, her greatest foe is not some spider-powered villain, but just simply the script. Because the script in this movie, it is. There's no way around it. This is a terrible script. Because bringing back the same screenwriters that were responsible for the disastrous Morbius movie does feel like a very unforced error on Sony's part that leads to very expected results, because this is some of the worst writing that I have seen in any comic book film, at least in recent memory, with this sort of dialogue and plot points and just a lot of genre tropes that almost feels like the product of some kind of AI algorithm. In the movie, it shows its hand very early on, because the opening sequence to this film is so cartoonishly kind of framed and the dialogue so stilted that it almost comes across as like an SNL sketch that's kind of lampooning the current state of the comic book genre. And those flaws, they, like a web, they extend all throughout this film, kind of to all the different elements and the characters. Because Cassie in this, she's joined by a trio of other characters who are seemingly destined to be kind of the future sort of Spider-Womans, the various side characters for Cassie Webb. And these are supposed to be teenage characters, although they are played by actresses, most notably Sydney Sweeney, who are all in their mid-20s, and they very much come across and act like young people trying to impersonate teenagers rather than any kind of believable kind of real-life teenager. And the villain in this, a man called Ezekiel Sims, falls victim to a lot of the same problems, where he just comes across more as like a caricature of the role rather than anything kind of fresh and like believable as the villain. And he really is just not given a whole lot to do other than delivering very kind of clunky, cliched bad guy dialogue, and not even delivering that all that well. And obviously, suspension of disbelief is necessary for all superhero movies, but Madame Web does feel almost like particularly illogical. And you see this in multiple different ways. There's a scene where Cassie is watching A Christmas Carol on TV, and it's the scene of Scrooge talking to the ghost of Christmases yet to come. And the dialogue, obviously, if you know the story, is very much relevant to like the themes of the story. Although the scene before she's watching this movie, she's shown to be at like a summer barbecue, which just makes the choice of watching a Christmas movie just seem very forced rather than natural. Or another scene where she seemingly takes a day trip from New York down to the depths of the Amazon jungle in order to get some kind of forced heavy exposition dialogue before she quickly gets back into New York and continues on with the story. And beyond just not being very kind of logical or coherent, the film also just isn't all that exciting. Kind of Cassie's clairvoyant abilities to see the future has tons of potential to really dive into some kind of mind-bending, trippy sequences. And there's a lot of stuff they could have done with that power. And I'm sure the comic books, the source material has gone into those directions. But the film just seems like it can't find any kind of clever ways to use those powers. And as a result, kind of that like the mechanic of being able to see the future almost renders all the action scenes in this movie just meaningless and void of stakes. Like, there's two extended sequences where the bad guy is assaulting the good guys, and he's shockingly killing off all these characters. Although it's very clear that this is a vision, and obviously all of it gets undone the moment that the vision ends. And kind of as a result of that, the action is just reduced to sort of a cheap way to showcase sort of shocking twists in action that, because the audience knows that that's not real and that's not actually happening, it just reduces it all to a lot of empty spectacle. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this film, there's really not a whole lot going on. Language, I counted maybe 7 to 10 different kind of minor profanities, as well as the names God and Jesus both get used multiple times as well. As far as violence, really nothing beyond the expected from like a comic book movie. Several people are shot and killed, which includes a pregnant woman, although the baby does survive that encounter. In another scene, the paramedic's hand is like all kind of covered in blood as she's trying to help a victim of a crash, which I believe is the only instance in this movie where we actually see like blood depicted on screen. And like I mentioned, there are several sequences where, you know, an adult male is assaulting these teenage girls, and it's, you know, he's throwing them around and punching them and, you know, killing them in certain instances. Although as visions, these never come to fruition as reality. As far as sexuality, really nothing here. There is a woman that wakes up in bed with a man. He's shirtless. She's wearing just a bra, although the covers cover from the chest down. And there's also some of these characters, some of the female characters do wear kind of slightly revealing kind of midriff outfits, but really nothing beyond that. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this, I think there is some interesting stuff that this film is touching on, even if it doesn't necessarily explore them with a whole lot of depth. I think like a lot of movies that do feature kind of clairvoyance, you know, the ability to see the future, kind of the obvious question that the characters ask is, do I have the power to change the future, or is that sort of determined in like my, you know, unchangeable fate? And kind of, I think in more like philosophical terms, this is sort of the debate, the tension between like free will and determinism. Do we have free will, or are we just sort of a product of our environments, and you know, whether that's biological or just sort of social in our families? And like I said, the script itself, I don't think necessarily has enough depth to really get into it, but I do think it raises some questions that are relevant for Christians. Because initially, Cassie views her powers really more as a curse than a blessing. They're just sort of showing her, you know, events and hardships in the future that she feels like she's powerless to change, until at one moment she does change her actions based on the vision, leading to very different results from what she saw, and helping her realize that she does have some agency. She can just kind of change the course of those futures. And kind of beyond just like the superpowered aspect of it, this theme also plays out on like a more personal level, because Cassie and sort of the 3 sort of teenage prodigies that she has under her kind of all find themselves in very similar but different kind of crossroads in their life, where they've been abandoned by their parents, or they feel like they're restricted from outside factors in their control, and they are kind of asking the question of, can they change sort of the trajectory of their life, or are they just sort of forced to continue on like this? So in some ways, sort of the superpowered aspect almost becomes like a reflection or like a metaphor of like the more personal challenges they're facing. And obviously this same tension can be found all throughout the Bible as well. On the one hand, there is verses that you know, that teach about predestination and kind of the idea that, you know, in God's sovereignty, all things are decided and, you know, according to sort of his perfect plan. While on the other side, there are also scripture verses that more teach that we do have free will, that we are accountable to our choices, that we can choose good, we can choose evil. And kind of Madame Web, obviously, it doesn't resolve this tension, although the movie at least ultimately lands on the side that we do have free will, and kind of the future is sort of a blank slate that we can change through our actions today. Maybe one other thing just sort of related to that is I think that the film also explores like how much future knowledge is beneficial to us, and at what point does that become kind of more crippling? Because Ezekiel Sims, the villain in this, he's tortured by like a vision that these three Spider Women in the future one day are gonna murder him and take his power, and he's sort of obsessed with trying to stop this from happening, and so he takes extreme kind of lengths to try and prevent those events from happening, which ultimately sets in motion the very events which he sought to avoid. I think as Christians we can recognize that there isn't a level of like God revealing future plans for us to give us the faith to keep marching forward, but then obviously knowing too much of what's to come without sort of the context and the wisdom of God's perspective can lead to disaster. Kind of this the famous command of God to Abraham, go to the land which I will lead you. So I think there is stuff, although the film obviously doesn't apply it in a spiritual way, I think there are some themes in here for Christians to kind of work through. So in the end, this is just not a good movie. There's not really a whole lot in this film that works. I do think maybe as a drama, like the kind of the found family dynamic of Cassie and these three teenagers, there is some charm to it. There is some of the relational stuff I think does work, even though if it does veer heavily into kind of cliches and tropes. It's just that I think as like a comic book movie, there's just not enough in this film to at all entice me to want to know like what happens in the future for these characters and to see how they kind of grow into their powers. This film is an origin story for the characters, although I think kind of following after the Venom movies and Morbius and now this lackluster movie, it does also seem like this might be the end credits for sort of the Sony Spider-Man version of this universe. But hey, would love to hear what you think. If you have a more positive perspective, maybe you just enjoyed this movie for what it was, or you enjoyed the dynamic, or you are familiar with the comics, jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about that. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys to subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. Got awesome movie reviews and podcasts and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.